have heard the mainstream media assert that crime is falling, even though many Americans believe it's actually getting worse, that America is becoming a much less safe place. Take the city of Chattanooga. A new Manhattan Institute report finds that Chattanooga, like many cities, did have a violent crime problem that was mostly brought under control. Yet polling confirms there's still a widespread perception that crime is on the rise in that Tennessee city. Manhattan Institute fellow Charles Fain Lehman says that disorder in the city, including public homelessness, trash, and drug-related violations, are partly to blame for this perception. Now, he writes that while Chattanooga is focused on bringing down violence, they've done so at the expense of other issues in the city. He says a similar pattern is emerging in Washington, D.C., where we are, where signs show that disorder is rising.
Lehman acknowledges disorder is hard to define, but some examples include retail theft, unsheltered homelessness, or public drug use. Charles Fain Lehman joins us now to discuss perceptions of crime and how they measure up to reality. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. I know you're very knowledgeable in tracking the statistics on crime, and so I wanted to have a more nuanced conversation about what's actually going on in American cities and what can be done to fix things. Over the long-term trajectory, right, we all know that there was massive amount of violence until about the early 1990s, and then there was a collapse in the violent crime rate for the next 2 decades or so. But in the last few years, some of that decline was reversed in some cities. There was a lot of crime during COVID, and now in a lot of places we've brought that back down, but it's not perfect everywhere. And Americans still feel very unsafe, like things have gotten a lot of worse. And I never want to tell people that their perceptions for what their communities are like are wrong, but that's what we do hear sometimes from some media commentary on what the actual situation is. So, what is your analysis of what's being done correctly to bring crime back under control, but how there's still this public disorder that has not been addressed?
Absolutely. And I think it's important to be straight about what kinds of crime we are talking about. In the summer of 2020, co-occurring with COVID and also the riots and protests following the murder of George Floyd, there was a large increase in certain kinds of crime, in homicide, in aggravated assaults, which is a proxy for shootings, and in car thefts. It's really that increase in homicide and aggravated assaults that's been coming down, sort of spiked dramatically over 2021, 2022, and then has been receding. And there's good evidence that we're close to or potentially back at 2019 levels. So that's a really big win. At the same time, you saw, particularly in large cities, an attrition at the level of police officers. Cops were retiring. Cops left for smaller departments. We can get into why that is. I think there are a host of factors. My argument is that what happened in a number of cities, what I've identified in Washington, D.C., what I've identified in Chattanooga, what I suspect has happened elsewhere, is that police forces that were operating with less capacity and saw an increase in interpersonal, particularly gang violence, that was driving this increase in shootings and homicides, responded by focusing more limited resources on just that. And they seem to have, in many places, succeeded. Not everywhere, not all the time, but that's a reliable strategy. But that strategy comes at the expense of dealing with more minor crime. And so in DC, for example, I have shown that there was a dramatic decline in enforcement around minor offenses, as much as a 99% decline in certain categories like prostitution arrests. That yields an increase in the level of ambient, what we talk about as disorder. And that increase is, in turn, I think, driving a lot of the perception of crime, that people sort of talk about crime as the same amorphous bubble. And so they're surprised to see that the homicide rate, a thing that they're usually not exposed to, is going down, because in many ways they are much more exposed to crimes that are less serious than homicide, but are still deserving of attention and are not receiving the attention that they need, in part because of more constrained resources.
So you mentioned a few things that I find fascinating here, and I'm glad that you get into the details of what a crime is and the perception of a crime. Also during the pandemic and the couple of years afterwards, I live in New York City, and I think this happened all over the country because so many people were, staying at home. There was a rise in domestic violence, and that, of course, was homicide violence too. It was a different type of homicide than, say, gang homicide violence, but that went down also, and that was the majority in a city like New York City. With that being said, you said there's a perception of crime. So homelessness okay, if you're staying in a location that is private, perhaps you could say that's a crime. But homelessness in general is not a crime. But it could make that perception. If you're in a safe city, New York City and many cities across the country are safer than they've been, as Robbie said, in the last several decades. Maybe there's an uptick, a slight uptick, but there is a rise in homelessness in many cities too, but that's not a crime. Someone might feel unsafe because they see homelessness or people who are unhoused and do not have mental health support. But is that necessarily a crime, or is that what's making people feel uncomfortable? And the media plays it up and politicians play it up.
Well, so I would say a couple of things. One is that descriptively, public camping or other acts antecedent to unsheltered homelessness are criminal acts, right? You can't sleep on the streets of New York. It's not legal. That is a crime. But I think the sort of broader point is that it is not a crime, perhaps in the same way that homicide is. It's not the same thing that we would talk about there. It's not what we call a major crime. It might be a minor crime. And there are other things that are in this category as well. Shoplifting, what we talk about as retail theft. There is some measured increase in felony, i.e. major shoplifting, but there's also an increase in minor shoplifting, people just taking stuff. That is a crime. It is larceny. It's larceny. That is not a major crime in the same sense, but it is much more prevalent, right? Minor crimes are by their nature much more frequent. And so I think we are much more sensitive to changes in the level of those minor crimes. I don't want to, though, sort of capitulate to the framing that these are sort of not criminal problems or not problems in which the criminal justice system can play a role in addressing, because I think that they are problems for the way in which people live together in cities and the quality of life in cities. And I think they have to be taken seriously as such.
Well, a couple of things. Homelessness is not a crime in New York City. There's a homelessness bill of rights in New York City, and I think there's several other cities who have that as well. Second thing is a lot of these statistics in terms of theft from stores were being, it was notorious. There were plenty of stores that shut down their storefronts claiming that there was criminal activity there, but turns out they were fudging their numbers. They were fudging it, and it was really just a decision from the top to save money, and they were using petty theft, as an excuse. Now, was there probably some? Sure, but it wasn't at the rate that they were claiming, and that was exposed in research.
I mean, here in Washington, D.C., right, Union Station for a while had to shut down. This is the beautiful-looking train station in the nation's capital that at one point during COVID had a shantytown on the front lawn of utterly disgusting tent community and deranged homeless or semi-homeless people wandering the train station, threatening people. And so Starbucks and a bunch of other businesses all pulled out of the area, and you had this, just total disorder-related collapse of this valued piece of a public space. Now they've finally paid attention to it and they've fixed a lot of it, and businesses have come back, and it's much nicer than it was 3 years ago. But I think that goes to show that if there is an utter collapse of trying to attend to, again, not like homeless people who are victims of poverty and are not really bothering anyone, but people who are homeless and also mentally ill and drug addicted and flailing about in the streets, does cause a problem.
Yeah, well, and again, I really want to emphasize sleeping in public is in basically all jurisdictions of the United States illegal. It was not in the Ninth Circuit for a while under certain conditions, and the Supreme Court has said that no, really, you can prohibit it, which is different from being homeless as a category or class. But this gets back to the point about behaviors in public which are problematic. There's categories of the homeless, and to get to Robbie's point. I think that many of these petty issues have gone unattended, related to shoplifting. You can look at municipal crime data. It shows in individual cities increases in reported shoplifting, instances of shoplifting, not just sort of claims by companies, but the actual level of shoplifting. The question in my mind is, what do we do about those issues? Because I think people rightly say this is not exclusively a problem for the criminal justice system, that we shouldn't just sort of round up all the homeless people and incarcerate them for many, many years. That's not a good solution. We shouldn't incarcerate petty thieves. But I think until we sort of say, look, there is a real disorder problem, there's a measurable disorder problem, and this is a problem, this is a thing that people have a right to be concerned about, we can't talk about sort of what are reasonable, effective, evidence-based solutions, which cover the gamut of interventions.
I understand what you're saying. However, I just find, I take issue with criminalizing homelessness, and in many cities they have decriminalized it in past measures. And that, again, is not a crime. Maybe there are some people who are unhoused and need mental health support, and that is what the country should be doing, is providing that. But instead to be looking at it through the lens of how do we get rid of these people, how do we deal with this criminal issue, rather than saying how do we support and find housing for unhoused, how do we provide more mental health care. I'm curious why your approach is more from the lens of it's all crime versus how do we create support systems that would prevent a lot of this from happening.
Well, so this is not an either or. This is a both and. You sort of move beyond the particulars of what is and is not a criminal offense. It is both the case that when you're dealing with an issue like unsheltered homelessness, you want to think about how you can shift people into shelter, how you can provide people with services, and also that much of the source of the problem is noncompliance. If you look at a city like DC, the levels of homelessness have declined steadily over the past decade. The levels of unsheltered homelessness have increased in the same period of time. The problem is not an absence of shelter beds. The problem is that people prefer to sleep on the street, and there are few consequences for sleeping on the street. Similarly, compliance with treatment for serious mental illness is a combination of carrots and sticks. There are great programs that exist in the city of New York for providing treatment for people with serious mental illness. They struggle to connect to that population, in part because the population is transient. They don't want to be constrained. So, I think my view is not we should exhaustively view this as crime versus we should exhaustively view this as sort of an issue exclusively for this population. My view is that we have to regard both of those things as we should regard as legitimate concerns, both the needs of those individuals and the needs of the community. We have to prioritize both of those things. We have to address what are the underlying problems, where the underlying problem is not just somebody is seriously mentally ill, but also somebody's behavior is disruptive to and dominating of the public space in a way that should not be tolerated, regardless of who they are.
One other thing I wanted you to address before we go is that I know I saw a lot of people online reacting to the most recent national crime data and saying, well, actually, if you look at it closely, it's not even counting so many certain large cities. And I saw you on X had a response to that wasn't completely right. Can you explain what the actual portrait is in terms of those most recent? That was the FBI statistics, I believe.
Yes. So to try to make a complicated topic as simple as possible, in 2021, a bunch of cities didn't report because the FBI was moving over to a new reporting standard and they were not in compliance with that standard. In 2022, the FBI said, okay, you can report under the old standard and we'll count you. So there were real problems with the crime data in 2021. Those problems do not obtain in 2022 and 2023. I think that in general, the trends that show up in the FBI data are correlated with reality. And you can say that this is true based on not just the FBI data, but by going and looking at individual city data. You can aggregate data. A friend of mine, Jeff Asher, runs a thing called the Real-Time Crime Index, where he's aggregating data from over 300 cities. And the trends look exactly the same in his aggregate as they look like in the FBI's data. So I think that signal is real. And I think it is much better use of our time to talk about why crime has declined rather than sort of saying, well, I don't think, the position that the data are fake depends upon the idea that 18,000 agencies in the United States are all faking their data, and then the FBI and all the state level departments of justice are compliant. I think that strains credulity.
Charles, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.